I want to begin this morning with a question. The question is, have you ever received an invitation to something that you weren't at all sure you wanted to go to? Maybe it was a wedding invitation from an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend. This happened to me when I was in college. My ex-girlfriend decided to marry my ex-roommate. I really didn't want to go, and I didn't. Sometimes the thing we're not at all sure we want to go to is something that doesn't sound terribly exciting to us because we don't have much of a relationship yet with them. Maybe your neighbor's daughter's preschool dance recital is something you're invited to, but you're not sure you want to spend 2 or 3 hours at someone's reception that you're just getting started with. Or maybe it's an invitation to something else. Maybe it's an invitation to something that has the potential to really change your life. Maybe you're being invited to join a new business venture or to work for a new company. Or maybe what you're having to decide about is accepting someone's marriage proposal. If you've been around the last month, you know we've been reminding ourselves that it is nice to be invited, because when you are invited, you feel valued. You find yourself feeling included. You realize that you have an opportunity to be something new, being part of something new and exciting, and being included feels great. But it is also true that an invitation demands some kind of a response. And generally, when you get an invitation, that requirement or request for a response is right there on the invite. RSVP, respond, please. Now, it seems pretty simple and a pretty simple kind of thing to request. But you know that how you respond is going to change your at least Friday afternoon, Saturday night, or maybe the rest of your life. In fact, it's the case that there are whole websites that will tell you how to RSVP in a good and easily done sort of a way. There are RSVP sites that will tell you how to say yes, how to say no in a way that doesn't sound like you're saying no. One of them is a whole 9-step process for RSVPing. I mean, who would have known it's so complicated to just say, to respond? And so every invitation requires some kind of a response. And for the last 4 weeks, what we've been doing is considering the invitation that Jesus extends. He extends it first to those 12 who are today called his disciples. He invites them to join him in his work of healing, saving, redeeming this world. It's an invitation that they spend their lives being with Jesus, going with Jesus. And as we discovered, when we go with Jesus, we just don't go for ourselves, we go for others. When it's good for us following Jesus, it's also meant to be good for the world. Today, we're going to find that Jesus is going to call the question. He's going to look at his disciples in the eye, and he's going to demand, in some ways, a response. He's going to ask them to RSVP. He's going to say, so now you've been with me all these months. Are you with me or not? Are you ready to come with me or not? And it's the same question that he asks us as well. So we're going to catch up with Jesus and the 12 by looking at the Gospel of Matthew today. And we're going to just walk our way through this conversation that Jesus has with these 12 disciples. Now, before I read this section from Matthew 16, let's set the stage a little bit. For several months now, Jesus had been investing himself in these 12 individuals. He'd been inviting them to follow him around, to listen to him speak and teach, to watch him do his work. He's even sent them out on a training exercise, village to village, where they have had a chance to put their own hand to doing good. But now it's gotten to the point that it's really he's calling for a decision. It's really a turning point. After many months of following Jesus, he's now going to call the question. And so we begin reading with verse 13 of chapter 16. So when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist. Others say Elijah. Still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Now there's some interesting things that are going on here at this moment in the ministry of Jesus that are worth pointing out. First and foremost is that at this stage of Jesus' public ministry, he has deliberately slowed things down. At the beginning, it was just a frenzy of activity as he was going from one place to the next, healing this person and then going and preaching here. And the disciples could hardly keep up with him. He says, now we got to go to another village and preach there as well. But now finally, he's slowing the pace down. And he is drawing his disciples away from the everyday sort of life they've been experiencing and pulling them away to this place called Caesarea Philippi. And we have a map of it, I believe, up here. If you see it up there at the top of the screen, you can see it's far north. It's far away from the center of Jewish life. In fact, it's on the very border of the Gentile nations. It's closer to Damascus than it is to Jerusalem. It was actually a 25-mile hike for those guys to get there. It's not only far away and out of the way, it was also a place that was full of spiritual overtones. For one thing, it was the place where the folks from previous ages had built a temple to the Greek god Pan, and in fact, you can still see the ruins of that even today. The city itself was named for the emperor gods of the Roman religion, the Caesars, and so that's why it's called Caesarea Philippi. And just to the north of this city, within sight of where Jesus had this conversation, stood Mount Hermon, probably snow-covered, as it often is during most of the year. And that is the mountain referred to in the Psalms as a source of inspiration for God's people. And so here Jesus brings all these 12 folks together. It's a place rich in spiritual significance, and most importantly, it is the crossroads of all these different religious viewpoints, Roman, Greek, Jewish. And so Jesus gets these 12 together here, and he slows them down because he has a question he wants to ask them. And before they answer it, they need some time to think. And that's why it takes time and reflection to answer those kind of questions. So here in that sacred place, set apart time, Jesus poses this question to these 12. Who do people say that I am? Now that's a very reasonable question to ask because the truth was everybody in Palestine was talking about Jesus right about then. Some were saying that he was John the Baptist come back from the dead to avenge his murder at the hands of Herod. Others said he was a fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies that Elijah or one of the prophets would one day come back before the end of the age. And almost certainly when he said, "Who do people say that I am?" it brought an interesting and probably extended conversation for a while as they discussed different theories about the identity of Jesus. But the truth was that wasn't really the question Jesus was after. The whole thing, that question, was really set up. Because at a certain point, he looks them in the eye and asks the question he really wants to ask. The question he had marched them 25 miles up to that sacred spot to ask. Verse 15. What about you? Who do you say that I am? You see, Jesus wasn't really interested in what everybody else thought. He wanted to know what they thought, what they believed, and what they were prepared to say out loud about him in front of each other. And almost certainly it was a pregnant moment. I mean, I imagine the disciples hearing that question and kind of looking down at their sandals, shuffling them a little bit, not sure that anybody really wants to answer it, almost like when a teacher at school asks a difficult question and everybody looks down at their books. But there's always that person in the crowd, in the class, right? That Hermione Granger, and she's got her hand up like this because she knows the answer, and she's going to make sure that everybody else knows that she knows the answer. And in this case, that person was Simon Peter. Verse 16, Simon Peter answered, "Well, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now, it was a remarkable response. It might not seem so remarkable to us because it seems obvious when we look at it backwards. But you have to understand it wasn't at all obvious to those 12 at that moment. First of all, Jesus had not yet said once that he was in fact the Messiah. In fact, whenever that question had come up in conversations with people in his ministry, he had done his best to steer that conversation to something else. And the truth is, the things that Jesus had been doing, healing the sick and feeding the hungry, as wonderful as those kind of things are, they weren't the kinds of things that these first century Jews were looking for and expecting from the Messiah. He hadn't challenged the authority of Rome, their oppressors. He hadn't gathered an army to fight them. He hadn't even aligned himself to the religious leaders of their land. And so it wasn't as obvious as we might think at all. But Peter got it right. He got it right. Jesus was the Messiah. Jesus was the Christ, the anointed one, the one that God had promised to send so many centuries prior, the one promised to turn the people back to God, the one that would set them free from their oppressors, the one that would make them the great nation that they once had been, the one that they had been waiting hundreds of years for. But Simon didn't just get the Messiah part right. He got something else right. Something even more surprising. He recognized that this Jesus had this unique and special relationship with Yahweh, the God of Israel. That this Jesus in front of them was one with God the way a son is one with a father, made of the same stuff, an extension of his presence and his influence in the world. And this was even a more remarkable kind of response because nobody saw this coming. And so on that day, something extraordinary happened. After many months of following Jesus around and listening to him and learning from him and stumbling about, Peter and the 12 finally get it right. Jesus is God made human. Jesus is God come down to save them, to redeem the world. And look at how Jesus responds, verse 17. "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." Now, what a moment that must have been for Simon and for Jesus as well. We're never told in the Bible that Jesus smiled, but you got to believe that he did here at that moment. like a parent smiles when finally, that senior in high school walks across the stage and gets their diploma. The kind of smile that a groom has on his face as he looks down the aisle to see his bride coming toward him. It had to be that kind of a moment for Jesus and for Peter. Finally, someone had it right. And finally, someone had the courage and the faith to say it out loud. And Jesus is asking the same question to us today. So who do people say that I am? If you spend any time at all with people, you know there's a whole variety of ways they answer that question about who Jesus is. He's a great teacher. He's an inspired leader. He's a revolutionary. He's just a myth. One poll says that 90% of Americans believe that Jesus of Nazareth truly lived. Half of Americans say that in one way or another, he was divine. Well, that's all interesting. But what about you, Jesus says? Who do you say that I am? And it's the most important question you'll ever answer. The most consequential question you'll ever have to answer, because how you answer that question will determine how you live and the kind of person you become, both now in this life and in the life to come. Now, many here have already answered the question along the same lines as Peter here. You've come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah of Israel, the Savior of the world, that he was and is God, come near to us to save the world, to save you from sin and death. But others of us here haven't gotten to that understanding. We're still curious about the whole thing. We're learning about Jesus. We're exploring that. We're not ready yet to say yes to that invitation yet, and that's okay. It's a big decision. It's not something you do without thoughtfulness. It takes time. That's why Jesus had given these 12 time to think about it by taking them to that remote place. And so to you, I say just keep on thinking about that. Keep on coming. Keep on learning about this. Join us for worship. If you're available for the 10:30 hour for the Alpha course, it's a great way to explore those kind of questions as well. But as dramatic and frankly as climatic as this moment in Caesarea Philippi was, it wasn't over yet. In fact, it's going to get even more dramatic and climatic. Verse 18, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, there is a lot we could say about this verse, but let me point out just a few things. First, and don't miss this, Jesus looks at Simon and sees Peter. He looks at Simon, this brash, impulsive fisherman that can't keep his foot out of his mouth, and he sees Peter, this rock-solid spiritual leader. And when Jesus looks at you, he doesn't just see who you are today. He sees who you can become in him. You are Peter, Petros, and on this Petra, that's the Greek word for rock, I will build my church. So Jesus is frankly making a pun here, a play on words between Petros and Petra. Now, there's a lot that we could debate about this very verse, and it's not a stretch to say that wars have been fought and churches have been divided over the interpretation of this single verse. But to simplify it, in my humble opinion, let me offer a simple caution that we not read too much into this one verse, and that we not read too little into this one verse. Some people have read this verse and concluded that Peter himself was the rock on which Jesus would confer a unique and special authority given only to him to lead his church, an authority that would not only be given to him, but would be handed down by him to subsequent generations of his successors. Now, my feeling is that that's reading too much into this verse. While I do believe Peter is the rock Jesus is referring to, I don't see him conferring some unique special authority and status onto Peter. I mean, that would run contrary to all the other things Jesus is going to say about servant leadership. And there really isn't anything at all here about succession. Others have argued, as they've gone to the other extreme, that the rock here is Peter's confession. You are the Christ. And so Jesus is promising to build his church on that confession of faith, not on some human personality. Now, my opinion is that that's reading too little into the text. I think Peter really was the rock Jesus is referring to here. That's why there's this play on the words. I think he was simply saying that Peter was going to play this formative, critical, dynamic role in the founding of the church, as we see him doing when we read through the book of Acts. In fact, I think Jesus' whole point is that he is going to build his church through human personalities, through fishermen that are turned into spiritual leaders, through people like Peter and that whole gang of 12 that are gathered around him. In fact, I think that's the whole point he's making in the following verses. Verse 19, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, so that whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. You see that word you? I will give you the keys of the kingdom. That you is the plural. That's y'all. That's yous. That's you guys. My Pittsburgh friends would say that's yins. And so what Jesus is saying is, look, I give to all of you, my followers here, the keys to the kingdom. Now again, it's important not to read too much or too little into that verse. Jesus is certainly not giving to these 12 disciples the authority to decide who gets into heaven and who doesn't. That's God's decision. But let's not miss the point that he's saying, I'm giving you the keys. I'm about to leave this place. I'm out of here. I'm turning this thing over to you. This is now your mission to fulfill. I'm putting my mission in your hands. In fact, that's the second blank. Jesus puts his mission into the hands of his followers. Now, the truth is, typically we get so hung up at times on this rock conversation that we miss some of the other important words in the verse, like the word church. On this rock I will build my church. This is the first time that Jesus uses that word, one of the few times that he will ever use that word. Now, I don't know what you think about when you think of the word church, but many people think of a place. Maybe it's a stone cathedral, maybe a kind of a New England clapboard, New England style church, or maybe just a storefront in the middle of a city. We think of a place as a church, but the word Jesus uses here, the word ecclesia, well, it's not a building or place at all. It's not even a religious word at all. It's a word that describes an assembly of people that gather together for a particular purpose. In fact, it was a secular word. It was a word that would be used for an army that's gathered together to have a parade or to go off to fight. It was a word that was used to describe the citizens of the city gathering together for a town meeting and making decisions or addressing some sort of a threat. In other words, ecclesia was a movement, not an institution. It's about people, not about a place. And so on that day, Jesus announces this. I'm starting a movement here. It's going to be a grassroots movement of ordinary people like you, fishermen, tax collectors, all sorts of normal, regular folks. And I'm going to fulfill God's mission in this world through you. You're the ones that are called to carry out this mission to save and redeem and heal and restore this world. Verse 18, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, Hades, in the Jewish worldview, was the place of the dead. Jesus isn't talking about hell here. He's talking about death here. Death, the last great enemy of all of us. Death, that one thing that none of us can get out of. Death, that one thing that sooner or later haunts our every day. Jesus says, nothing can stop this movement that I am beginning with you. Not even death. And to prove that he wasn't just blowing smoke that day, he will show himself to prove it by, in a few more months, dying on a cross and rising, overcoming death. And so that's the third blank. Nothing can stop the movement Jesus started. And so here we are, 2,000 years later, and what we discover is that that prediction was true. Because despite all sorts of attempts throughout the centuries to wipe out, to stamp out, to snuff out this movement, the church is still on the move, the largest, the most diverse, the most influential, the most formative movement human history has ever seen. And don't miss this, our presence here in this room today is a fulfillment of Jesus' prediction 2,000 years ago. And we are invited to join this Jesus movement. You see, when you say yes to Jesus, you're not just saying yes to him, you are also saying yes to his movement, his church. His church. I will build my church. Jesus loves his church. That's why he called it his bride. Jesus lives through his church. That's why he calls it his body. Now, I am fully and intimately aware that the church and churches have not always gotten it right. At times, the church at large or individual churches had just done great damage to the gospel and to society and to people. Ask parishioners in Pennsylvania the kind of whirlwind that they find themselves in after hearing some of the horrific damage done by leaders in the church over the last 50 years in that state. Maybe in the church you grew up in, you find yourself damaged as a result. Maybe you're here today and you're just starting to put your feet back in the water of the church after being gone a long time. Maybe you've drifted away for a while. You've turned away for a while because of the hurt you've experienced because of the church. I get that. What I don't always understand is what's my role to bring healing to that kind of damage. I can say, and I will say, I am sorry for the kind of hurt and injury that has so often been brought to people in the name of Jesus. But those are just words. But the truth is, despite the frailties and the warts of the church, Jesus has just not given up on his church. And we dare not give up on it either. Now, if you are out there beyond the walls of this church, and you start conversations with people, and they start talking about intimate stuff in their life, stuff like what they believe about life and eternity and God and what matters in life, and those conversations eventually perhaps go to the whole issue of church, I almost certainly you're going to find plenty of people that say, well, I love Jesus, just not the church. And again, I understand the hurt and the disappointment behind those kind of sentiments. But loving Jesus and not the church is just an option Jesus doesn't offer here. As one blogger has put it, saying that you love Jesus but hate the church is like saying you love your best friend but you hate his wife. That relationship is just not going to last. The truth is, you need the church, warts and all. And the church needs you, warts and all. We all need each other, because that is how God designed this movement. It's a movement of ordinary people, not angels, not flawless people, broken people who bring themselves to this purpose, to this mission, to be agents of love and grace to this world that so desperately needs to hear about that. And so that's the fourth blank, if you're filling them in. When we say yes to Jesus, we become a part of his church doing his work. We began today by being reminded that every invitation demands a response. And I guess I'm crazy enough to believe that Jesus may have led you here today to this place, to this set apart place, just like he had led Peter and those 12 to that sacred place called Caesarea Philippi, that he led you here as he led them there to ask you a question. Who do you say that I am? And how you answer that question will determine not only how you live, but also who you become, both now and for eternity. Now, some of you may be ready to say yes to that invitation. Maybe after weeks or months or years of listening and talking and reading or wondering, you're ready to say yes. Yes, I trust you, Jesus, to forgive me for my sins and failure. Yes, I want you to lead me in a new kind of life. Yes, I want to put you on that stool and let you sit there. Now, I know a lot of us made that decision maybe a long time ago. But maybe today he wants you to decide how you'll decide. And maybe one of the things he wants you to do and invites you to do is take the next step in your journey by saying yes to something beyond just that first yes. Maybe yes to being baptized, to publicly declaring your faith in Jesus. Maybe yes to joining some kind of a group where you can have the intimacy and the accountability and the encouragement of people that know what's going on in your life day to day, certainly week to week. Maybe he's asking you to say yes to serving him in one of the ministries like Sheila has been serving so faithfully for the last 50 years. Maybe he's asking you to say yes to your neighbors, as Morgan spoke about. But the truth is, it's a question he asks. We have to decide what we'll do with it. Now, the truth is, you still might not be ready to say yes. You're still sorting it all out, and that's fine. This is a big decision. It's not meant to be taken willy-nilly. It takes time to think through, are you really going to let someone else sit on that stool? But sooner or later, we have to decide. Because one of these days, maybe today, Jesus is going to look you in the eye and say, what about you? What about you? Who do you say that I am? And I just don't want you to miss that invitation if he's extending it to you today.